Today, driving a vehicle with 5 soldiers in the back. She was laughing, the soldiers were laughing. It looked like a family outing, not a military operation. I do not understand how they won the war if they treated it like a game, but they did win, and we lost. So perhaps it is we who do not understand. The confusion was not limited to enlisted men. High-ranking officers, intellectuals, men educated at prestigious universities, struggled with the same dissonance. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation government deliberately placed women in visible roles throughout Japan, not as a provocation, but as policy. Female journalists, translators, administrators, and aid workers moved freely through Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima. They spoke to Japanese civilians, distributed food, organized schools, and everywhere they went, they carried with them the unspoken message: this is what democracy looks like. This is what freedom allows. Back in the United States, American women, with themselves who were grappling with the end of the war. Many were being encouraged, sometimes pressured to return to domestic roles, to make room for returning soldiers in the workforce. But the precedent had been set. The genie could not be fully returned to the bottle. Women had tasted independence, earned their own wages, proven their competence in realms previously forbidden. And while the post-war years would see a retreat from some of these gains, the foundation had been irreversibly altered for the Japanese soldiers witnessing this from the other side of the ideological divide. The implications were staggering. If American women could work, drive, command, and contribute to victory without weakening their nation, if, in fact, their contributions had been essential to that victory, then the entire moral architecture of the Japanese empire had been built on a lie that strength required subjugation, that order required silence, that national survival depended on keeping half the population locked away from public life. Thejip kept appearing in the streets of Yokohama, on the docks of Sasebo, driven by women in uniform, women with maps and clipboards, and the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. And each time, Japanese observers felt the same vertigo, the same sense that the ground beneath their understanding of the world was shifting. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan itself had begun to change. The new constitution, drafted under American guidance, granted women the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to education. These were not gifts. They were corrections, imposed by a victorious power that understood something Japan's militarists had refused to see: that a nation's strength is measured not by how tightly it controls its people, but by how fully it allows them to flourish. The Japanese soldiers who returned home carried with them the memory of American women, driving jeeps through the ruins of their empire. Some dismissed it as an aberration, a temporary madness that would correct itself once the Americans left. Others quietly wondered if perhaps the war had been lost not on the beaches of Iwo Jima or in the skies over Tokyo, but decades earlier, in the decision to deny half their population the chance to contribute fully to the nation's potential. In the end, the revelation was simple and devastating. Freedom was not weakness. Equality was not chaos. And the society that had embraced these principles had not collapsed. It had conquered. The American women they had been taught to pity or despise had helped build the arsenal of democracy, had kept the home front functioning, had freed men to fight by taking on the work that needed doing. And in doing so, they had exposed the rottenness at the core of the ideology that sent Japanese soldiers to die for an empire that wasted half its strength. The jeep rolled on, and in its wake, an entire generation of Japanese men was left to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that their defeat had begun long before the first bomb fell in, the moment their leaders decided that a woman's place was anywhere but behind the wheel. September 2nd, 1945. The morning sun broke over the deck of the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. Among the first waves of Japanese soldiers surrendering to Allied forces were men who had spent years believing in the absolute, a superiority of their empire's social order. They had been told that the West was decadent, morally weak, and doomed to collapse under the weight of its own indiscipline. But in the days and weeks that followed their surrender, these men would encounter something their military education had never prepared them for: the reality of American women, not as propaganda caricatures, not as distant abstractions, but as living proof that everything they had been taught about gender, duty, and national strength was built on sand. The Japanese Empire had constructed its wartime ideology on a foundation of rigid hierarchy. Women existed within a carefully prescribed role: obedient daughters, devoted wives, silent mothers. The concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, had been the pillar of Japanese femininity for generations. Women were expected to serve, to sacrifice, and above all, to remain invisible in the machinery of public life. They did not question. They did not lead. They certainly did not drive trucks, operate radios, or stand shoulder to shoulder with men in factories that built the instruments of war. To do so would have been unthinkable, a betrayal of the natural order that held the empire together. When the first Japanese prisoners of war arrived at American-run camps in the Pacific, Guam, the Philippines, Okinawa, they were braced for humiliation. They expected cruelty, perhaps starvation, certainly the kind of treatment they themselves had inflicted on Allied captives. What they encountered instead was a photograph, a single image tacked to the bulletin board of a mess hall in a POW camp on Guam. Late September 1945, it showed an American woman in coveralls, welding torch in hand, her face obscured by a protective mask, sparks cascading around her like a halo of industrial light. Beneath the image, a caption in English, "Rosie the Rivet can do it." The Japanese soldiers stared. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke, a piece of wartime propaganda meant to mock them. Others stood in silence, trying to reconcile the image with everything they understood about civilization. A woman doing a man's work, not as a desperate measure in the final days of a losing war, but as policy, as normalcy, as pride. One former Imperial Army sergeant, whose testimony was recorded by American intelligence officers in October 1945, said through a translator, "We thought it was a trick. We thought you were trying to shame us by showing us something impossible, but then we saw your women, driving the trucks that brought our food, typing the documents for our release, wearing trousers, smoking cigarettes, speaking to men as if they were equals. We did not understand. We still do not." This was not an isolated reaction. It was the beginning of a profound ideological fracture. The Japanese military had spent years indoctrinating its soldiers with the belief that American society was weak precisely because it allowed women freedom. Freedom, they were told, was chaos. Discipline was strength, and discipline required women to stay in their place, silent and subservient, so that men could focus on the purity of duty and sacrifice. But here, in the wreckage of their empire, Japanese soldiers were witnessing something their commanders had never warned them about, that the United States had not collapsed under the weight of female independence. It had thrived. The statistics were undeniable. By 1945, more than 6 million American women had entered the workforce in roles previously reserved for men. They built bombers, assembled tanks, manufactured ammunition, operated switchboards, decoded intelligence, and managed logistics networks that stretched across the oceans. The American war machine, the same machine that had overwhelmed the Japanese military with its sheer scale and efficiency, had been built, in part, by women, and not because men had failed, but because American society had unlocked a resource that Japan had deliberately kept shackled inside the POW camps. The revelation deepened. Japanese prisoners were assigned to work details, and they quickly noticed something strange. The American officers overseeing them were often women. Not nurses, though there were plenty of those, but women's Army Corps officers, Marine Corps women's reserve personnel, Navy waves. They gave orders, they inspected work, they maintained discipline, and the male soldiers under their command obeyed without question, without shame, without the collapse of morale that Japanese doctrine insisted would follow. One particular incident, documented in the archives of the War Relocation Authority, occurred in November 1945 at a processing camp in Manila. A group of Japanese officers, men who had commanded battalions, who had overseen brutal campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, were being processed for repatriation. The officer handling their paperwork was a U.S. Army lieutenant, a woman in her mid-20s from Iowa. She was efficient, polite, and utterly uninterested in their shock. When one of the Japanese colonels attempted to address only the male clerk standing behind her, she corrected him firmly. "I'm the one processing your documents, Colonel. You'll speak to me." The room fell silent. The colonel hesitated visibly, struggling with the indignity of taking orders from a woman. But he complied, and in that moment, something fractured. Not just in him, but in the worldview he represented. Because if American women could command respect, if they could hold authority, if they could contribute to victory without destroying the fabric of their society, then what did that say about the empire that had forbidden such things? The symbolic object that haunted these men, more than any weapon or flag, was the American Jeep. Small, rugged, ubiquitous, it became the unlikely emblem of a larger truth. Japanese soldiers watched American women drive jeeps through the muddy roads of occupied Japan with the same ease as men. They loaded supplies, transported personnel, navigated rough terrain. In Japan, women were not permitted to drive military vehicles. In many cases, they were not permitted to drive at all. The jeep, therefore, became a rolling contradiction, a machine of war operated by those who, according to Japanese ideology, should have been incapable of such autonomy. One captured diary, translated and preserved by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division, contained this entry from a young Japanese infantryman in December 1945. "I saw a woman,